Good evening. I was recently asked to look into high ability learners and do a little bit of research about student success and how schools are determining, how students are going to be successful and placement into those high ability learner programs. I learned some interesting things, so I wanted to share that with you today. First of all, the school that I looked at is a predominantly white community. Basically, only 15% of the student population is considered from a different race or ethnicity. The school itself has 43% free and reduced rates. The special ed rate is 25%. And overall, with the students' NISA scores, they're generally 60 to 70% proficient overall. I was able to look at a couple of students and compare their particular scores. In looking at their trends and then comparing that to where they're currently placed in the high ability learning program, generally their assessment results correlated very well with where they were placed. So I had a student that was not doing quite as well on MAPS and NISA scores. That student is not currently in the high ability learning program. And then I have another student that is doing very, very well and exceeding in most areas, and that student is a part of the high ability learning program. At the school that I'm working with, they use a matrix where they use student scores, so testing scores, student grades, teacher observation, parent observation, even peer referral, and then overall creativity and strength in particular subject areas in order to determine whether or not a student would qualify for a high ability learning program. So even though the data that I looked at generally seem to be that NISA scores or MAP scores might predict whether or not a student was in a high ability learning program, I do know that at a basic level, the school I work in, that there's opportunity for students who have other creative issues to be in that program. Looking at some research, it was really interesting to find out that there's a lot of particular traits that, according to research and speculation, are highly related to student achievement. Looking at a couple of those, there was one was an interview of a research psychologist who's highly successful, and she looked at basically grit, is what she called it. Basically the determination, the flexibility, the resiliency of kiddos and how that then relates to their success rate. And basically what she's finding is that students who have more of that grit or more of that self-control are generally more successful later on in life. Another study that was looked at was in regards to teachers being able to predict the success of students without actually getting any kind of data to look at to separate them. It was really kind of interesting. Second grade teachers were allowed to rate basically what they thought was the top quarter of their class. And essentially, without utilizing grades, they were able to predict then what students the next year would end up qualifying for higher learning programs. And basically what these researchers were looking at was kind of trying to see if we can't measure some way these particular skills that these teachers are seeing more informally in the classroom and see if we can't formalize that somehow into some kind of an assessment. And basically in conversation, they learned from these teachers that things like motivation, self-efficacy, and then demographics, also self-discipline, and then positive attributional style were all rated as things that those teachers just kind of observed overall as to how they thought or how they would then predict if students were successful. Finally, another research study I looked at kind of took that information and really attempted to make it more concrete. And what they did was they're actually trying to develop a survey that will assess some of these skills that some of our research has already indicated is an attribute of student success. So they kind of summarize it into students who generally succeed. There's three main areas, and that's their success is related to cognitive ability, it's related to social skills, and it's related to self-management skills. So they essentially then tried to create a survey that could be passed out to students or rated by teachers that would then allow us to determine whether or not these students would be successful. And it was kind of interesting. They noticed that there was definitely a correlation. They're definitely still working on this. It's called the Student Engagement in School Success Skills survey. So I look forward to potentially learning a little bit more about that, and also, using that as maybe a tool for students themselves to learn where some of their strength areas are. So overall, I think that after reviewing some research and considering what our current school is doing, as I said before, I think there's definitely a correlation related to student test scores and then whether or not they're going to be included in the high ability learning program. I think it would be important for our school to encourage teachers to consider students who don't necessarily have those high test scores, because there's certainly room within the matrix that's used to qualify students for that program that they wouldn't have to have high test scores. And I think it would be important for us as a school to kind of break down that barrier that, that's one of the areas where we don't necessarily have to have hard and fast data or high test scores to point to say that this student is going to be successful or is highly creative or highly motivated. So I think even though the policy is in place, I think it's important for us to maybe change the culture a little bit about how some of those students are referred and how they're served. So hopefully you learned a little bit from this information that I learned as well, and I appreciate you listening in.